There are moments in politics when the noise drops away and what remains is clarity. Not clarity about policy or ideology, but clarity about character. The late-night Truth Social post shared by Donald Trump depicting Barack and Michelle Obama using racist imagery is one of those moments. It is not complicated, it is not ambiguous, and it does not require creative interpretation to understand what it represents. The video itself is revealing not only for what it shows, but for how it is presented. For most of its runtime, it pushes familiar election conspiracy claims, claims that have been litigated, debunked, and financially punished through one of the largest defamation settlements in American history. And then, at the very end, almost as if slipped in deliberately to evade scrutiny, appears an AI-generated clip depicting the former president and first lady as apes. The imagery lasts only a second. That brevity is not a defense, it is the point. Racist symbolism has always relied on suggestion rather than argument. It thrives on the wink, the nudge, the just asking questions posture that allows the speaker to deny intent while ensuring the message is received. This video follows that pattern exactly. It invites plausible deniability while delivering a message that is unmistakable to anyone familiar with the long history of racial caricature in American politics. The reaction was swift and predictable, not because outrage is fashionable, but because the meaning was obvious. Democratic leaders condemned the post outright. Anti-Trump conservatives, many of whom once defended him, described it as indefensible. Even within Republican circles, the silence that followed was telling. Silence in moments like this is not neutrality, it is accommodation. What makes this incident particularly important is not that it is shocking, by now very little shocks the political system, but that it strips away lingering illusions. For years, Trump's defenders have argued that his rhetoric is misunderstood, that critics exaggerate, that context is always missing. But context cuts both ways. The context here includes years of racially charged language, the birther conspiracy aimed at Barack Obama, attacks on judges based on ethnicity, and repeated flirtations with extremist symbolism. Seen in that light, this post is not an outlier, it is continuity. There is also the question of responsibility. Some have suggested that Trump may not have watched the video carefully before posting it. That argument fails on two levels. First, the President of the United States is responsible for what he amplifies, regardless of authorship or intent. Leadership does not allow for casual reposting without consequence. Second, even if ignorance were plausible, it would still reflect a reckless indifference to the power of the platform he controls. Social media is not a private group chat. It is a megaphone. When the president shares content, he endorses it, politically, morally, and symbolically. That endorsement carries weight not only domestically, but globally. It signals what is acceptable, what is tolerated, and what will go unchallenged by those in power. Yet the racial dimension of this incident cannot be separated from its political strategy. Barack Obama remains one of the most popular political figures in the United States. Michelle Obama is widely admired across party lines. Attacking them is not about persuasion, it is about provocation. It is about energizing a base that responds to grievance and resentment more than policy detail. And it is about reframing political conflict as cultural warfare, where outrage itself becomes the objective. This tactic has consequences. It normalizes dehumanization. It lowers the threshold for what can be said, shared, and excused. And it shifts political debate away from governance toward spectacle. When racial insult becomes content, democracy becomes collateral damage. The defenders who rush in afterward often follow a familiar script. They argue that critics are overreacting. They claim the imagery is fake, altered, or taken out of context. They insist that attention itself is the real problem, but these defenses collapse under scrutiny. The video was real. It was posted by the president. It remained online, and it was archived because people recognized its significance immediately. More troubling than the post itself is what it reveals about the moment we are in. The presidency, once constrained by norms of dignity and restraint, is now treated by its occupant as a content channel. Outrage is not a byproduct, it is the currency. And racism, when it provokes loyalty rather than consequence, becomes a tool rather than a taboo. This is not about partisan disagreement. It is about whether there are still lines that matter, whether the dehumanization of political opponents, especially through racial caricature, is something the system will reject or quietly absorb. History suggests that what is absorbed today becomes precedent tomorrow. There is also a broader cultural cost. When political leaders traffic in racist imagery, it does not remain confined to politics. It filters into everyday interactions, workplaces, schools, and online spaces. It gives permission, and permission, once granted from the top, is difficult to revoke. None of this requires speculation about motive. The impact is enough. The Obamas were depicted using imagery that has been used for centuries to demean black people. The Post reinforced falsehoods about elections, and it was shared by the most powerful elected official in the country. Those facts alone demand accountability. Accountability, however, does not come automatically. It requires institutions, media, and voters to decide whether this behavior is disqualifying or merely another headline to be endured. It requires clarity about what leadership means in a diverse democracy, and it requires an honest reckoning with how much damage has already been normalized. This incident is not a distraction from real issues. It is a real issue, because a politics that tolerates dehumanization will eventually justify worse. Words shape behavior, symbols shape beliefs, and when those symbols are weaponized from the highest office, the consequences extend far beyond one late-night post. This is the first layer of the story. What follows is not just about condemnation, but about what comes next, how power responds when boundaries are tested, and whether this moment will be remembered as another step downward or a line finally drawn. The real test of a political system is not how it behaves when norms are easy to follow, but how it responds when those norms are deliberately violated. The racist video shared by Donald Trump is not merely an offensive act, it is a stress test. And the question now is not whether the imagery was wrong, that question has already been answered, but whether the institutions and individuals who surround power are willing to respond with anything more than temporary outrage. History offers a useful lens here. Political leaders who erode norms rarely do so all at once. They advance incrementally, pushing boundaries, gauging reaction, and adjusting accordingly. If the response is muted, the next violation comes faster and goes further. If the response is firm, the behavior either stops or becomes politically costly. What matters is not the initial act, but the reaction that follows. In this case, the reaction has been loud but fragmented. Condemnations arrived quickly from Democratic figures and from conservatives who have long distanced themselves from Trump, but from much of the Republican establishment, the response has been notable mainly for its absence. That absence sends a signal, not just to Trump, but to future political actors watching closely. It suggests that there are still incentives to look away. This is how normalization works, not through agreement, but through tolerance. When behavior that would once have ended careers is instead treated as another cycle of outrage, it becomes part of the background noise. And once it becomes noise, it loses its power to shock, but not its power to harm. The harm, in this case, operates on multiple levels. On a personal level, it targets two individuals who have already endured years of racially charged attacks. On a communal level, it reinforces stereotypes that have real-world consequences for millions of people who share their racial identity. And on a democratic level, it corrodes the idea that political competition can exist without dehumanization. It is also important to recognize that this moment did not occur in isolation. It arrived alongside renewed election falsehoods, personal glorification posts, and escalating attacks on political opponents. Taken together, these elements form a pattern, a politics driven less by persuasion than by domination, less by argument than by spectacle. That strategy thrives in environments where accountability is weak. Social media platforms reward engagement, not integrity. Outrage spreads faster than correction, and political incentives often favor base mobilization over broad appeal. In that ecosystem, the most extreme content often becomes the most effective, but effectiveness should not be confused with legitimacy. A democracy does not collapse because people disagree fiercely. It collapses when disagreement is replaced by dehumanization, when opponents are no longer seen as fellow citizens, but as enemies to be mocked or diminished. The ground shifts beneath the entire system. Supporters of Trump sometimes argue that critics should simply ignore him, that attention only fuels the behavior. There is a kernel of truth in that argument, but it is incomplete. Silence can be strategic when the issue is provocation alone. It is dangerous when the issue is precedent. Ignoring behavior from the presidency is not neutrality, it is abdication. This is especially true given the global audience of American politics. When the President of the United States shares racist imagery, it does not remain a domestic controversy. It becomes a signal to authoritarian leaders elsewhere that norms are optional, that power can be exercised without restraint, and that identity-based attacks are compatible with democratic branding. There is also a generational dimension to consider. Younger Americans are watching closely. They are forming their understanding of politics not through textbooks, but through timelines. What they see shapes their expectations. If racism is met with consequences, they learn that boundaries exist. If it is absorbed without meaningful response, they learn that power excuses behavior. The media plays a complicated role here. Coverage is necessary, but repetition can also dull impact. The challenge is to avoid treating this incident as just another headline, stripped of context and consequence. It must be framed not as a gaffe or a controversy, but as a choice, one that reflects values, priorities, and intent. Elections alone do not enforce norms. Voters enforce norms, parties enforce norms, institutions enforce norms. When each actor assumes someone else will respond, the result is collective inaction, and collective inaction over time becomes complicity. There is a temptation to believe that the system is resilient enough to absorb this behavior without lasting damage. American democracy has survived worse, the argument goes. That may be true, but survival is not the same as health. A system can endure while still being weakened, coarsened, and hollowed out. What is at stake here is not the reputation of one individual, but the standard by which power is judged. If racial dehumanization does not disqualify, what does? If truth no longer constrains speech, what replaces it? These are not abstract questions. They shape policy, governance, and civic trust. The presidency is not merely an office, it is a symbol. Symbols teach. They instruct the public on what leadership looks like. When that symbol is used to amplify racist imagery, the lesson is clear, even if unspoken, and there is still a choice to be made. This moment can be treated as another scandal to be weathered, or as a line that clarifies expectations. That choice belongs not only to political elites, but to voters, media organizations, and civil society as a whole. Accountability does not require unanimity. It requires consistency. It requires the willingness to say that some conduct is incompatible with leadership, regardless of party or popularity. And it requires the courage to hold that line even when doing so is uncomfortable. Moments like this linger. Long after the video is forgotten, the response to it will remain part of the historical record. Future generations will not only ask what was posted, but how it was answered. And in that sense, the most important question is not what Donald Trump intended, but what the country is willing to accept.